Hello, welcome to Modern Education. We are in the Memorial Building as per usual, and we have a little bit of a change up this time. I have in the studio Chris Lowrie, and we are here to talk about a conference that we attended on Tuesday, the 28th of May, and we have some really exciting stuff to talk to you about. Just would like to give some random studio business with Modern Education, KZSU 90.1. If you'd like to call in at any point during the show, the number is 855-723-9010. And as always, we are on social media through Instagram, on Modern Education, on KZSU, and Twitter. And feel free to reach out to us. And I'd like to invite Chris on the mic. How are you today, Chris?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
So would you like to give our listeners a little bit of background of who you are so they can give a little bit of an identity to this voice? So can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am an environmentalist. I studied environmental science and geography in college, which mostly means that I studied human and environment interactions, so how people influence the world around them. And currently I'm a student at Columbia studying climate and society, so how public structures influence our chances to solve climate change. Let's put it that way.
Well, that is perfectly fitting for what we're about to talk about today. This conference that we went to on Tuesday was a really exciting one. It was sponsored by the Office for Science and Technology of the Embassy of France in partnership with the Presidio Trust and the Bank of the West. And we had a very special meeting with Larigauderie, which is the Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and Jean-François Silvain, the President of the Foundation for Research in Biodiversity. And this conference basically talks about, with these two people, and off of the global report posted by the UN, which is, can you tell us a little bit about that report, Chris?
Yeah,
actually,
so the UN has this forum for scientists to work on policy together. It's for scientists to cooperate and produce reports and peer review each other's things and really produce solid science that policymakers around the world can then pick up on. So they've just concluded this assessment that as a result of mankind's efforts, what we could call the human enterprise, that as a result of transforming so much land and our activities, we are at risk of losing 1 million species to extinction in the next 10 years.
Wow. That's a lot.
So this is it's a big number, and it's a heavily reviewed report. The report itself is 1,500 pages detailing exactly what is happening. It was submitted by a few hundred scientists. And so it just kind of details, if business is as usual, this is kind of the effect. And they break it down into a bunch of categories. What do we expect to lose? Which species, which types are most at risk? Spoiler, it's amphibians. And so that's the reason for the event that we attended.
That's great. Well, I personally really enjoyed this event because we were, like I was saying, we were able to speak to these two people, and they gained some great perspectives to us on this kind of collective consciousness of what biodiversity means and what these implications actually mean. Also gave some nice, fun review or interview questions on their passions and what they actually enjoyed during this. And I'd like us to just play this for a second. And again, if you have any questions pertaining to the interview, please call in at 855-723-9010.
And we should say that the interview, the video of it, can also be found online. And if you're interested in this report, it was produced by IPBES, that is IPBES, and it stands for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Hope you enjoy.
For coming here and talking with us as a part of this conference. And I first The first question that I have is more about, of the global report that has been released itself, if you can give us just like a general brief on what the global assessment is and how readers can reference this document.
Yes, so the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services is a 3-year effort that has engaged about 500 scientists around the world. Together, they have analyzed more than 15,000 scientific publications, so it's been really a lot of work. Yes, and they've also received, at various stages of their work, comments from the community at large. We call that peer review in science, and they received 20,000 comments, so it's been extensively peer reviewed, and so we are quite comfortable that it really represents the views of the international scientific community. So that's for the process, which is very important because it ensures, your credibility and your legitimacy. And so now in terms of the content, so the report overall shows that there is really an unprecedented impact of the human enterprise on the planet. So, for example, it gives a lot of numbers, such as 3/4 of the surface of the planet are under human influence. Only 13% of the oceans can still be considered as wild, and more than 85% of our freshwater ecosystems have disappeared. So those are 85, yes. And freshwater ecosystems are quite rich in biodiversity. So that's for sort of like the broad picture. It's really a global phenomenon, and its rate and spread is unprecedented in human history. So one number that has really sort of hit people consciousness around the world is this idea of the extinction of species, and the report says that there is about 1 million of species that are threatened with extinction out of an estimated 8 million of species of plants and animals. So 1 million out of 8 million. So it's really a global phenomenon, and some groups are more threatened than others. For example, amphibians. Also because of what I just said before, their habitat, the freshwater habitats, are disappearing, and therefore that is affecting their very existence. And the coral reefs, you may have heard that coral reefs, about 1/3 of the species that build coral reefs are disappearing. So that's that. And now, of course, that has a lot of consequences. On our very existence on this planet, on the long-term capacity of people to continue to sustain their lives and also to continue to have a proper quality of life, as we call it in IPBES.
And I have to say, the French quality of life is absolutely amazing. You can go to the supermarket and pick up some fresh food, and fresh bread and wine, cheese. I mean, we have less of that here in the U.S. So that quality of life, I don't know, is like less in our faces, I want to say, but it's definitely... I just had to comment on that, basically.
No, but that's also part of that conversation, and you're perfectly correct, because the report also shows that there is a loss in the diversity of all of our
foods.
So like all of the, for example, the races of cattle that we breed, it's becoming more homogenized. So in France, we used to raise about 50 species of cow, for example. Each region just about had its own type of cow that was used either for meat or for cheese, and very specific, and they were adapted to the local circumstances, the local weather, and that now many of those are being lost, and so we're going towards homogenization, and that is leading to all sorts of problems. And the same for apples, or for many types of grapes, and many others. So yes, we are losing also that local diversity, which makes life's richer also, right? So it's also a question of values as well, which we also touch upon in the report.
I mean, I'm just thinking of coffee itself.
Coffee
beans is one of those that's on the list.
Pollination,
Yeah, sure.
it's pollinated by bees and other animals, and especially coffee. So that's losing.
There's this phrase that we didn't domesticate cattle and corn and cattle domesticated us and became the most prevalent species on the planet.
Yes.
Partially because
Yes.
Exactly, yeah. And that again shows that we've moved towards a world that is very homogeneous, and that is not a good model, because it's leading to all sorts of problems, including diseases because of this homogenization, and so there are many reasons for.
Homogeneity means fragility. It means that if you have a illness, you're dispersing on a cattle breed, for example, you will lose all of the individuals.
Yeah.
If you have a variety of breeds and so on, you may avoid that kind of danger, risks.
Yeah, what I find so interesting about this is sometimes within this talk of biodiversity is that you don't really think about how one species or one plant, one insect can really have this domino effect onto other resources. And that goes into also like the idea of biodiversity. So, I mean, would you like to expand on that?
I'm just wondering, I feel like for a lot of people the concept of ecosystem services is still a little bit up in the cloud, and the concept of losing biodiversity and the human impacts of that, I feel like that's really started to come out in the last few years, that when you're talking about the environment, we're talking more about human impacts. Could you maybe give some context to people on what it really means? Like, what will this have as a direct impact? What are some examples of what their lives might be like in 10 years?
Yeah, I can start, and then you can you can pitch in as well. So the report gives a series of categories of at IPBES we talk about ecosystem services. We also talk about nature's contributions to people, and so we have 18 categories, and they are grouped in 3 broad ones. And so the first one that people may not be all that familiar with is the regulating contributions. And so if we lose biodiversity, we are going to impact on a number of contributions that we derive from nature. For example, we are talking about coffee, so pollination. Pollination is an important regulating contribution. If you no longer have bees, but other pollinators as well, you're going to have an impact on the capacity of plants to set seeds, and then you are going to reduce your yields, or sometimes have no yield at all. So that's something that is it's a service that our crops benefit from, and there are areas where pollinators are disappearing because of pesticides and diseases and many other reasons, and you start seeing the yield of crops decreasing as a result. So that is an example of the loss of several species that can have an impact on a service, pollination, that is useful for growing our crops, for example. But you also have examples such as filtering water, for example. You have plants that through their roots are making a water of good quality. And if you remove forests or in places where our water is taken for drinking, you lower the quality of drinking water, for example. So that's another regulating service, water purification, that people may not be aware of, but that if you remove biodiversity, then you are going to have perhaps to build a plant to clean the water, to replace that service, because nature will no longer be providing it. And there are many, many other examples of that nature, such as, for example, soil richness or...
Yes, or organic matters degradation. When you have leaves falling in water, in streams, you have a lot of organisms that will degrade all these things. And you need that for the cycles, for the living cycles. And also you need oxygens. And the plants are playing their role.
Yeah,
and so on.
And perhaps the big one is contributing to control climate change, because of course many plants, all plants fundamentally, but filter, they sequester or they absorb carbon from the atmosphere, and in so doing they absorb a lot of carbon emissions. But in fact, or taken all together, the vegetation absorbs about a third of our annual emissions of carbon. So they really contribute to solving the climate change problem. But if you cut those forests, or if you, then you are going to exacerbate climate problems and warming. And so the vegetation, forests, they can really be part of the solution to climate change. And in fact, if you manage your forest properly, if you allow them to grow more, you are going to take more carbon out of the atmosphere and to solve part of the climate change problem. So that's another example of a contribution that nature gives us as well.
Absolutely,
So,
it's invaluable.
It's like the balance, like we were just saying, of replenishing these areas as opposed to thinking of it as just solely like necessarily an individual act or individual causes, but this collective idea of how we're going about this, I think is really interesting. I'm thinking about it on a balance factor of like our reefs or planet or trees, etc.
So you're touching on something here, and I'd really like to hear you expand on what a healthy service for this looks like. If our homogeneous rows of corn and our cattle and all of these things are going to homogeneity, what does it mean to develop this in a way that you can feed the world in a healthy way?
yeah.
The IPBES report show clearly that there are some major factors that are decreasing biodiversity and ecosystem services. One of these factors is the way we are developing a very industrial agriculture and breeding, for example, using a lot of incomes or products coming from overseas, for example, to feed cattle and so on. It's really clear in Europe because we are doing that. Importing soybeans from South America at the expense of deforestation, for example. That's a big problem. That means that we have to rethink about that. Can we still continue to have that kind of agricultural system? Or we have to think in some way to come back to a more equilibrated way of producing goods, agricultural one, breeding one. And it's one of the most interesting outputs of the IPBES report is to say that you have direct factors acting against biodiversity, but also you have indirect factors. Among these indirect factors, you have the increase of the human population, because that increase of the human population is going together with an increase in the amount of goods they need. And also, you have to certainly we have to rethink all the socio-economic systems that now are spread in all the world in order to decrease the pressure we are exerting on biodiversity. And these pressure are decreasing the ecosystem services humans are using. The nature is not giving ecosystem services to the human. It's the humans that are using services from the nature. That's a different view.
Yeah, it's an important framing of it.
Yeah. That means we have the interest of the report is first to have been able to put together a lot of data, of information that researchers, in fact, know since a long time, but we are not able to really push and obtain from decision maker to keep in to have that in their mind, and we have seen, but Anne can explain that there have been an incredible amount of newspaper articles, TV report, and so on. That means that this time we have been really able to push a message towards decision makers.
I feel like it has to be, at least coming from also the outsider, of like the way that we are seeing this manifest in our day-to-day lives, we're actually starting to see the impacts.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet we still have a very strong sense of deniers who say this doesn't exist, it's just natural. So what would you exactly say to those people who deny that this isn't an actual problem we need to be thinking about and facing within our policies and government, like we see today in America with President Donald Trump?
Well, you always have to go back to the facts that, thousands of scientists are measuring this, and they are, producing thousands of articles. And so what is in the report is only based on measured facts, and nothing has been made up. And so science is an important human endeavor that has brought us where we are today, and we need to continue to have to trust science and to really not question it. That's really very fundamental, and especially here in this country where science is questioned, that's a very serious problem, and that is why organizations, mechanisms like IPCC for climate or IPBES for biodiversity were established. It's really to harness the power of science to inform decision making, so that people cannot say we did not know, because now scientists have spoken.
So what would you say are some of the big takeaways you took from that interview when we were talking to both Anne and Jean-François?
Wow. Well, one part is that they represent the scientific side. Mm-hmm. They represent the research side that informs people on what is happening, and where possible that informs people on what you can do to change it. They're particularly providing information that policymakers can pick up on. That's one of the main reasons that they're doing what they're doing, is so that other people can adjust their habits accordingly and understand that if they don't, this is the trend that you are on. And if you do, maybe you can change it.
And they also mentioned during this conference that the last report that they put out, and that this year's review, that pretty much all the countries failed, right?
Yeah.
What was this called again?
So there's something called the Conference of Parties, and this exists for both the IPCC and for IPBES, and it's when different signers on of these agreements convene every once in a while. And they check in on goals that they've set. And for IPBES, they're going to, in 2020, have a summit in China. And they're going to say that they've pretty much unequivocally failed. So
that's so sad.
They set these goals, and these are UN stated goals that countries sign on to. And in this case, we've said that we haven't met them. And as a result, we're in a worse place than we would have been.
So is this something different from kind of the climate the Paris Accords that the U.S. backed out of?
Yes.
So this is actually completely separate. Okay. So can you describe the kind of like the balance or the differences between, because these are essentially climate change versus biodiversity.
Yeah. So it's important to understand that this is not climate change. It's impacted, and there are linkages between climate change and this, but they're different things. This is us losing ecosystem services and biodiversity through a variety of human actions. So that's land use, that's deforestation, that's our use of fertilizers, that's roads that cut through environments and cause fragmentation, that's urban environments and losing a lot of trees, and farming practices. It's a whole host of things, and climate change certainly impacts it. So for example, warming of the oceans is going to cause a huge impact to marine life. That is entirely tied to climate change, but they are different things. And so the solutions to biodiversity also may solve some climate problems and vice versa, but you can kind of see them as separate things.
Okay. So biodiversity being kind of the ecological sense of these are how the plant's functioning, and climate change being the actual weather bit. Does that kind of give a good general
that's I would think of it. Climate change is pretty much the carbon in the atmosphere.
Okay.
So with climate change, we have 1 trillion tons of extra carbon in the atmosphere. You can see that you want to pull down if you want to get our temperature back to a normal range.
Mm-hmm.
With biodiversity, you have species that you're losing, and that is going to have a huge host of impacts on the natural environment. And that includes our crop production, for example.
And that even goes into the way that us as humans have pretty much created our landmass, which has destroyed some of these biodiverse places.
Yeah. I don't know the exact number, but somewhere between 50 and 75% of land has come under human control now. That's a huge amount of land that we're exerting pressure on, and it's not behaving exactly naturally anymore.
So what is that, when we're talking about naturally, is this before humans touched?
Yeah, that's kind of hard, because if you... when humans first left Afro-Asia, when they left the really big continent and went to Australia and North America, initially we actually caused mass extinctions then also, which is a little gloomy. But our entrance into these other continents actually caused the extinction of lots of large animals and a lot of smaller ones, and we started changing plant habits and things. You know, we have huge impacts, and we have for a long time. So any extinction that you're seeing here, you can kind of see in context of the past of humanity has been causing these things, because we're a very disruptive species. Yes,
we are. And speaking of very disruptive, one of the best areas to look at are just right around the corner in San Francisco. And then right across, we can see New York. Then right across pond, London.
Mega cities, yeah.
Exactly. When we're talking about cities and urban development, it's kind of a strange topic to think of biodiversity in urban space. But there are efforts that are happening in urban spaces, because they are, as scientists are putting this information out there, people actually in the cities are creating spaces and new ideas for biodiversity to flourish. And in the panel itself, they actually described the Presidio as one of those spaces, and which is rich in history, all the way from military development to what it is now as, I believe, as, what was it, a national,
it's not quite a national
forest,
park,
but
it's a national recreation area.
Recreation area. So this area is specifically maintained for its biodiverse species and plants.
Yeah, it has this really interesting aspect, because the Presidio was actually started with the intention of being the first economically profitable park or recreation area, or national set-aside area. And so its goal is not just to maintain biodiversity and limit the number of people who try and come in and trample on that. It's actually to invite a lot of people to come appreciate this inside the middle of San Francisco, and also to host a lot of businesses and economic output.
Which we see through Central Park and Hyde Park. So these are just some very small examples of just setting aside a piece of land for environment to do its own thing.
I mean, parks are awesome. I think
they are beautiful.
Parks are awesome. But those are really interesting cases, because parks are this amazing public good that everybody can use, and in some of these cases, it takes a lot of planning and foresight to do it. So Presidio is one example. It was under military control by several different nations over the last 300 years. And over that time, some parts of it were left untouched by the military. Some of it were completely repurposed. And to transform that back into what it is now and rehabilitate the land was a pretty massive effort. And it involved really thinking through their actions on what species they wanted to introduce and when. And they used this phrase, which I really liked, called taking the creeks out of the pipes. So if you look at a city like San Francisco, very topographical, lots of hills, there's lots of places that water would naturally be running, but we've paved over it. And that pavement has some huge impacts. But if you take these creeks out of the pipes, as they say, and you start producing wetlands, for one thing, that has a huge impact, because we've lost so many wetlands. That's one of the big takeaways from the reports, that wetlands and freshwater ecosystems are among the most damaged that we have now, in terms of how many of them have been modified.
I think it was 85% of wetlands have been modified. And I'm thinking just recently of one, I believe, I really hope I'm getting this right, but that there's Google is planning on expanding over on these wetlands. I'm trying to think of exactly where, but I am not familiar with this area enough to say
Google
exactly.
San Jose office?
No, it's not in San Jose. It's still in, like, I want to say Mountain View, a little bit more east. But there's all these wetlands, and this guy was telling me, all of that area is going to be Google now. They've bought that space. It's going to take years. But it's just like, you see these areas. It's beautiful. It's completely open, but it is also you can tell it used to be 100 times more beautiful and flourishing with ecosystems than what it is now. And I can't even imagine what it's going to look like once they do develop Google. It's just like little things like that, where companies are taking in on land and not thinking of the long-term consequences of building on that land, or what that actually means.
Well, a big aspect of this conference, like you're talking about, is how do you preserve land in urban areas?
Yes.
And how do you actually think ahead to what you're building and who will get to use it, and if it's going to be, if there's enough public support that you really want to preserve this land there. And I think we're lucky in the Bay Area in that we do have large amounts of set-aside land. That's not everywhere, and it's not equally distributed, and not everybody can use it quite as easily as everybody else, but we do have large stretches that help preserve our watershed, for example, the Santa Cruz Mountains. We just have a lot of places that still have some natural beauty to them.
The Bay Area really is a special place on that way, that like many other cities, urban developments, you don't really see. But
this concept of urban development is interesting, and they touched on it a lot, that it's not just setting aside the land for the Presidio. The Presidio is really founded on the idea that people in San Francisco want to have the Presidio. And they really made that a point, that the Presidio is a lot more viable long-term because they do a lot to build public support for it. And seeing how important...
grassroots.
Yeah, it's grassroots. And seeing how important green spaces are to people's health, tons of research has come out on that lately, that just being able to see greenery throughout your day is it's a huge determinant of mental happiness.
Being able to walk outside, feel the breeze, see the trees, smell the flowers... It does something. It does something magical to you.
When you're looking at something like losing lots of biodiversity, the answer is, obvious answer to that is, what do you change? And so a large part of this conference was discussing urban habits and how you preserve land within urban spaces so that it is still useful. There are plenty of people still using the Presidio for a variety of activities, but that it's also, kind of a haven for species. And that has a ton of benefits beyond just people being able to see pretty trees.
Yeah, exactly. So that goes to my question to you of, why does this matter? Like, why should, I don't know, whoever is listening to this right now thinks that this maybe sound really interesting, I wish I could help, but why do I need to start changing my habits or thinking about this in long-term means than my short-term gratification? So why does this really matter?
Well, I think that's hard. You're talking about changing people's habits.
Yes.
Right? And
how to win their hearts and minds right now.
I think you've seen that a lot with climate science, that for a long time bells have been rung, a very long time bells have been rung, but there were not good solutions people could take forward out of it. And there's this whole thing of, the glaciers are melting and the world's rising and the reefs are going to die, so you should change your light bulb, kind of thing. And that, I think there's a lot of dissonance there, that people don't quite connect, how do I actually take an action on this sort of thing? And so that's one of the reasons, building grassroots, trying to just start thinking ecologically is really important, but also, working to protect public land is a huge part of it, and working to create havens within an urban environment where species, can persist. And so, protecting the Presidio and Golden Gate Park is huge. Developing gardens within the city is huge. There's an effort in Berkeley right now to create green corridors so that certain species are not, you don't have these little parcels of gardens. You have gardens that are privately maintained, but all linked together in a way that provides for something else.
It is linked between like houses, per se, or businesses?
Between houses or alleys, for example. Turn some of the walking alleys into these green corridors.
Yeah.
And that has huge potential. Yeah.
And so when we are talking about biodiversity, this is something that is very specific to each area, right? So like when we're speaking about putting certain plants or species into San Francisco, it means something completely different when we're talking about Southern California, per se, or going into the desert. And as well, I'm thinking of farming, another example. The way that we farm and cultivate these farms are completely, it's all dependent on the geography. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. If you look at farming, we, over history, have just tended to go towards this monoculture thing. We've picked a couple species of corn and a couple species of cattle, and we say, like, this is it, and we cover the land with lots and lots of those species, individuals of those species. And then we try and keep everything else out. So we'll say this land is specifically for one species of corn, whereas previously it had this whole ecosystem. And that's done a lot for our ability to produce lots of corn. You can say that we have successfully produced a lot of corn.
Yes, we have.
But along the way, right, that's not exactly the only marker of how well humans are doing is how much corn we've produced. And so there are one example of an alternative way of farming that has kind of caught on a little bit is agroforestry and this thing called multistrata agroforestry. This is just one example. There's all of these alternative farming practices. And with
Can you explain that? What agroforestry?
So instead of growing one species, what you try and do is replicate a natural environment in a way that produces food, lots of food for humans. And so instead of growing one species of corn, you grow trees that bear fruit, and underneath those trees you grow other species that support them and support insects to come in, and bushes and shrubs, and you have this whole kind of created forest condition, but you do it with specific species that we benefit from having, and then those species are all providing ecosystem services to each other, which means that you don't have to use pesticides and you don't have to use fertilizer, and you can have a much healthier environment that still produces lots of food.
So are there any complications when we are talking about man-making, creating these spaces as opposed to something that just naturally happens? Like, are there any complications at all, or are we just mocking something and it will work?
Well, something like that. One example is right now that's a lot of these are really manually intensive. So the trade-off is that you don't have to create fertilizers. You don't have to dig up oil or coal or whatever you're going to make your fertilizer out of, which is usually fossil fuels. And instead, what you need is lots of people, because you can't use a big tiller or, you can't use combines and things on these forests. You're instead like picking fruit off of trees, which is, can be a lovely hobby, but it's not, it's very hard.
It's very intense if we're feeding a whole country.
Exactly. Yeah. That's been, one of the big questions of climate science is how do you scale some of these things?
Yeah.
And I think that applies to biodiversity as well, is that you have these solutions, but you're not quite sure, how do you replace the monoculture that the Great Plains have become with something that is rich and vibrant and supports more birds and supports more insects and still rehabilitates the wetlands? And, to fully replace that is a huge task that you have to look at as a huge task.
And I think what you're getting at especially is really important, is that we need communities, we need the grassroots local people who are actually making efforts to this, which is what the organization IPBES has been trying to do too, of incorporating their work not just to policymakers or scientists, but to people in their communities. And I mean, reading this report sounds very daunting, and you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much going on. I might as just let the world die. I don't know. I really hope that's not how people see it. But there is something to be said that because we have been hearing all of this, like, the world's going to end, the glaciers are melting. It feels just like there's so much that we really can't do much. Like you're saying, well, I might as well just change my light bulb, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting topic when talking about how do we humanize these things that our scientists are saying, as well as, unfortunately, our presidency is saying is non-existent, and not a problem that we are facing. And so how would you say we should go about these debates that
that's a huge question.
It was a very big question, but I mean, like, at least on practical terms, like, how do we win the hearts and minds of people on this subject? Like,
I mean, when you're looking at these things, it's huge. I mean, it's described as huge, right? That we say once somebody starts diving into what 2 degrees of warming means, it goes from this small number, like only 2 degrees, to like, oh, the ice caps melt and everyone dies. And bleak, all of these things. And I think that's been a struggle to convey that there are like effective things an individual can do, and all of our collective actions, you have to find a way to add up to something. So, small items like where you get your food, that adds up to something. And especially in urban areas, I think you at least have the potential to create better ways to get that food, because you have lots of people who can work together to produce in a good way. And yes, anything like, a household garden can provide spaces for butterflies and bees. And if you put all of those together, then you can have more butterflies and bees within a city. Decisions on how you use land within a city turn out to be really important. I mean, that's one of the big takeaways of this, is that you really have to think actively about how you're using your land, and that can be really small parcels, or it can be the biggest park.
Exactly. How we're using our land is really important.
There's this interesting topic that they touched on called sharing versus sparing.
Yeah.
And it's the idea of how much do you intensify something? So if you take one piece of land and you just say, you can do whatever to this land, just fertilize it, pesticide it, do the whole thing, grow as much as you possibly can on here. And at the same time, whatever you would have spread out elsewhere, just save that. So how much can you compact all of our growing, all of our land use into small areas, and those areas are essentially sacrificed? I'm still, I'm not sold on how great that is, because I think it's hard to contain that devastation.
Yeah, to keep one area solely for that.
But there's this interesting aspect of what do you intensify and what do you set aside? I mean, that's a good way forward to be looking at this, is like, okay, so if we have this need, how are we going to move this forward in a positive way, rather than destroying our environment and species in general. It's one thing that I find really interesting about this on the topic of biodiversity is just the fact that one little species can make such a big difference on the actual ecosystem that is at play. So one example that they gave on the panel was just one of a hippopotamus. So this little hippopotamus going in and out of the water actually produces certain bacteria that helps the water systems in his environment. And I find that just so fascinating. And then Jean-François, same idea with the bugs on the windshield, as we spoke to earlier. He just driving down this on the freeway, before you would have to stop and clear your windshield because there are too many bugs on your windshield. Now it's not a problem. He's speaking and referring to France in Europe. I can't speak for here, but I'm assuming that we at least have seen way more of a decrease in our actual critters. And that is specifically what Jean-François had studied, our critters. One of the big arguments to be made here is that these are not just pretty animals for us to look at. I mean, they can certainly be that too, but protecting these critters has direct, if you want to make the economic argument, you definitely can in this case. Ecosystem services can be quantified, and you can say, instead of using so many pounds of fertilizer, what if I can produce this land in a way that just brings birds back? And if you can do that, those birds, those insects, they provide a service to you, and that can be measured. So that's one of the interesting areas of biodiversity, and climate science is starting to catch on to it a little bit more, I think, that if you're going to make the economic argument, you can actually win the economic argument in a lot of these cases. If you were, for example, in climate science, if you were to price coal properly and say, account for all the asthma it produces, account for the actual economic problems from severe weather, all of these things, like renewables come out way ahead in there, and you have an economic win.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think a lot of this is framed in the short-term benefit over a long-term benefit or long-term cost, short-term cost. And sometimes these aren't necessarily put into context of long-term benefit.
Yeah.
It's short-term. And I find that just, overall in politics, very frustrating. In economics in general, very frustrating that we don't look long-term. But like you're saying, if you actually put these economic benefits and how they quantify, they actually don't add up in the way that we scale them today.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
The term that would normally be used is externalities.
Yeah. There we go. So, just to talk about the actual conference itself, the panelist, here, let me get this up. So let you ramble for a second.
Yeah, it was interesting. We had a good, varied panel. So we had a professor from Berkeley, we had a leader of the Presidio Land Trust, we had these two scientists from the UN, and it really, it speaks to the global nature of some of this, that, you really have to think about carefully constructing this, because the solution in one place is not the same as the solution elsewhere. So
exactly, it's climate sensitive or geography sensitive.
Yeah, it's very geography sensitive. You have to, there's no blanket solution here that will say, turn every house into a park and put a garden on top of it, or. But I think listening to the experts on this, they really alluded to this. Like, when you're talking about this scientific report, it's thorough. This is not a couple scientists sitting in a room saying, this is what my one piece of data shows. And this is hundreds of scientists and PhDs. This is intense. This is a thorough report. And when they come to it with knowing the whole history of, say, climate science. They have an idea now of how they want to present this and how intact their arguments have to be. And it's just an amazing scientific effort even to have a forum on an intergovernmental level like this.
Exactly. And that's, essentially what Anne was saying was that it's so important to be able to have these policy makers who are saying these things, or scientists saying these things, but as well, the application is what matters. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that as much. But just to go back on the panelists, I just wanted to list off their names so you can, any listeners interested in these people, these topics, can look to them. The first was Lois Stringer. He's the Associate Director of Natural Resources at the Presidio Trust. So that he really got into the idea of how maintaining the Presidio and what that meant. And he actually was showing these beautiful pictures of the Presidio where it was before they've actually had the development. It's just dirt. After, beautiful trees. It's just, it's crazy to see that you can make difference on these lands, whether or not they have been used, or I want to say destroyed.
Destroyed is fair. If you saw the before and afters, if you see the before and afters of the Presidio, it was heavily used as a military compound for a long time. Yeah.
So it was shocking to see that itself. I'm sure you can find those online. I'm sure if you go in Presidio before and after, something should come up. Justin Brashers, hope I'm saying his last name right, is the professor at UC Berkeley and GRNW8 WM Gortez Chair. He has done a lot of his research on wild animals and conservation, as well as natural habits, how natural habitats affect the dynamics of animal communities. And yeah, all of those minds, because John and Anne were also on the panel with all of these minds, international and domestic to the US. It gave a really great overview of how we can implement this and what people are saying. Just wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
And do you have any other lasting comments that you'd like to say about this conference in general, things that stuck out? I mean, for me, things that just stuck out to me was just really on the terms of biodiversity, how the chain reaction domino effect is really at play. It's very sensitive.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen a lot of examples now. You talked about the example of a hippopotamus.
Yeah.
A more local example you can think of are the wolves in Yellowstone. So wolves existed in Yellowstone, or what we call Yellowstone, for a really long time. And when they disappeared, or there was a period where they were gone, and we reintroduced them, and we learned a lot that these top animals have a really big ripple effect throughout their food chain. So the wolves being reintroduced had major effects on the plant life in Yellowstone, even though wolves don't eat plants. It's the fact that wolves would eat more elk, there were fewer elk, and the elk were a little bit more wary of wolves, so they wouldn't intensely pick at all of these willow trees. And so now the willow trees and the stream banks are better. And that led to beavers coming back and building dams. And,
interesting.
Beavers can be destructive sometimes, so that, pros and cons of having a beaver. But
pros and cons of having a beaver.
But, point being, I think that we've seen a lot of examples now of ecosystems are highly interdependent. And if you pull a species out, you're going to have effects where that species was playing a role in an ecosystem. And one of the main points of ecosystem services, when you're talking about it, is that you want to create a healthy ecosystem and you benefit by it being healthy, just by the fact that there's all these interactions.
I think that's the important thing to really take away. You do benefit from this. There is a greater good coming out of efforts around this, not just the fact that we're making these quick decisions about efficiency or using, I need to drive my car, little things like that. There are these bigger efforts, and there are people out there who are pushing these ideas forward to policymakers.
There's a really interesting book on some of these things, and it touches on ecosystem services a lot. It's called Drawdown.
Okay.
So when we talk about this light bulb kind of problem,
so Drawdown is a great resource to reference
great
to.
resource.
Is this online?
Yeah, there's an entire project. Basically, somebody saw that there was this huge discrepancy between what the damages of climate science were and what people were being asked to change. And so they went and profiled hundreds of things, I believe about 100 things, and quantified how impactful they were to actually solving climate science. So some of these are different forestry practices, how we manage our waste, how we use our land. Really interesting resource if you're looking to figure out, some of the solution space, if you will, in here.
So name that again, the breakdown? Or
Drawdown.
Drawdown. The Drawdown. All right. Well, we are out of time, but I would like to thank Chris Lowrie again for being on the show with me.
Thank you for having me.
And as well as the Science and Technology of the Embassy of France. I would like to thank Eber Bravo for the production of this show. And thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you have a great weekend.